What's going on, everybody? This is Alex Quinn, and you're listening to the Hustle Inspires Hustle podcast. On today's episode, we have Robert Kurzban, former professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and the founder of Bondzy. What's going on, Rob?
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I'm really excited to have you on here, man. I've been consuming some of your content online. You've been doing it for quite some time, so congratulations to you.
Thanks.
Congratulations on Bondzy. Before we go ahead and get started, I know I have some questions for you, but I want to give you a minute or two to give a quick intro on yourself, who you are, and what you're up to these days.
Yeah. So I was trained at what's called an evolutionary psychologist. So I did my PhD out in California. So evolutionary psychology is a field that uses what we know about evolution by natural selection to try to understand and explain human behavior. It's basically Darwin applied not just to non-human animals, but to people. So that's where my background, as we'll talk about. So I was heavily influenced by, after my PhD, I spent some time with economists at the University of Arizona in the econ department there. And then I spent some time with anthropologists at UCLA and Caltech. Then I came to Penn, where I did research on a bunch of different topics, which we can chat about. And now, as you know, I've developed this little app, and I also work for a nonprofit. So I've been really trying to give back to the community here in Philadelphia. So some of your viewers might know who Jose Garces is. So he founded, along with B. Garces, an organization a number of years ago. And so I work with them trying to bring education and healthcare to immigrants in need.
Oh, nice. Okay. So you've got quite a bit on your plate. Really cool to see that you're not
Yeah.
only working on informing people online through your content, but also helping others who need help. Um, did you always know you wanted to go down this route? How did you fall into this field?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, my childhood was really, spent in a book. I spent so much time reading science fiction that I knew eventually I wanted to be a scientist. Mostly it was because the people in these books typically save the world, and I was a kid, so I thought I want to save the world. That sounds good. So I thought I would go into science, and then if I'm honest, I learned a lot about how science works. And around 2014, I started a program at the Fells Institute of Government at Penn. It's a Master of Public Administration program, which guides people towards the public sector, towards nonprofits, because look, don't get me wrong, I still love science, but not the way that a lot of stuff actually gets done. So my trajectory, in many ways, it was sort of all science at first, and then I did that degree program, and then now here I am in the entrepreneurial space and the nonprofit space. Look, you never know how your life is going to go.
Yeah. You mentioned evolutionary psychology. One of my mentors recommended me a book called Evolutionary Psychology. It's this thick book.
Yeah.
I have it sitting on my shelf. I've only gone through like 10 pages of it, but I've been recommended not just by my mentor, but many people in regards to understanding human psychology and marketing, which is what I do. I'm a digital marketer. So I've been, it's been top of mind for everybody that I've been speaking to lately. Have you read it?
Well, yeah. So I would say I've read almost everything in the field, but look, there's a gentler way to get into the disciplines. So if you read Steve Pinker's How the Mind Works,
Mm.
basically that is an evolutionary psychology text that's much more approachable. And then there's a book by Jeffrey Miller. The title escapes me for the moment, but that book looks specifically at how evolutionary psychology informs marketing. And I think it could be really valuable for people who, because you're totally right. Like, my view is that the best explanation we have for human social behavior, human behavior, is to be found in grounding it in evolution. And then
Yeah.
if you understand human behavior, then, marketing and so on can become that much easier because you understand a little bit better about what motivates people.
Are you the only person in your family that works in this field?
I am. Yes, sort of. Well, it's funny. It depends how you define it. So interestingly enough, I have an aunt who is a professor of psychology at Penn State, just sort of down the road.
Yeah.
She does developmental psychology, and so you can imagine, there's not always a great relationship between developmental psychology and evolutionary psychology. So Thanksgivings have occasionally been, a little spicy.
Okay, I didn't know that. Can you unpack that a little bit? What are the differences that both have?
Yeah, so I mean, they're really not at each other's throats. It's just
Yeah.
evolutionary psychology is sort of a new field, and it draws on ideas which many people find a little worrisome, right? So like there was a history of people importing biology into the study of human cultures and that history. I'm thinking now about social Darwinism and eugenics, and many people, when they think evolutionary psychology, it evokes those ideas and this idea that everything is, innate and everything is determined, which is definitely not the view of the field. But it can create sort of a little bit of tension just because people bring into those conversations, maybe some biases that they have, or really it's misconceptions. I think that's really at the heart of it.
Understood.
Yeah.
And talk to me about Bondzy. When did
Yeah.
this idea conceptualize?
Yeah. So, I am in a very, very happy monogamous relationship right now, but I got the idea when I was on the mating market. And something about me is that, and this is also true of everyone in my family, is that I am weirdly punctual. I am very reliable. So,
Okay.
on that, we had an appointment for this call. I was right there in the waiting room at the
Right.
moment. And what I found on, when you're using apps like Bumble and Tinder is that, many people, this will shock your viewers, but they tend not to be that reliable, right? They don't show up, they cancel at the last minute. And and so this created a problem for me because I know that from my conversations, I know that, look, if people just knew that I was a reliable person, they'd be more likely themselves to show up. They're like, well, maybe he won't either. And
Mm,
so this intersected a little bit with my background, believe it or not, in evolution and in economics, because this is a problem that biologists and economists would call a signaling problem, where there's some information about me and it's not visible. I'm a highly reliable guy, but you can't just look at me and be like, oh yeah, that
he's
guy.
reliable. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, right. So it's the distinction in economics between cheap talk, which is, unreliable signal, and an honest signal, which is often costly. So I was like, wait a second, what if I could post a bond that says, look, Alex, I'm going to be at the coffee shop at 2:30. And if I'm not at the coffee shop at 2:30, you're going to get, whatever it is, $20, but that's going to be, for you. So that gives me so now that I know that I have skin in the game, right? So
Mm.
I have an actual incentive.
You're calling it a bond. That's so funny. That's cool.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, everything about this was, your viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with so many entrepreneurial stories. It wasn't my idea. Like one of my good friends came up with that. And so yeah, you're basically posting a bond and you're like, I'm gonna be there. Now the nice thing about that is once I posted the bond, you're like, oh, okay, well now I'm gonna show up. And so the way the app works is I go to the app, I post the bond, it sends you an email that says Rob is gonna be at the coffee shop at 2:30. And if he's not there, you're going to get blank. And then it's got a payload field where I put blank in.
Yeah.
But if I am there, then I go there, I open up my app, hit the button that says redeem the bond, and then I'm good. So the inspiration really, honestly, it's so bad to say, but like I was just so frustrated with, people not showing up. I said, well,
Yeah.
what if I could give them a way to kind of do an honest signal instead of cheap talk? And then it's all driven from economics where they develop these ideas and in the animal literature.
What is your opinion, or maybe even your professional observation, as to maybe why there's so many cancellations? Do you think that people maybe are afraid to meet someone new? Maybe is it their first time on the app, and maybe you're that first person, and they're antsy about it? I've never gone through the process of a dating app, so I'm not entirely sure how it works.
You're like the last person in the country, I think, who hasn't been like,
If
yeah,
Instagram counts as a dating app, then yeah, I'm part of
yeah.
the Go ahead, and none of the
So
other.
yeah, here's what I think. So first of all, you're younger than I am, but when I was in, middle, not that I had a ton of dates in middle school and high school, like if you canceled within like a day or even 2 days of a whatever, that would be you wouldn't necessarily be ostracized, but that would be considered quite bad form, right? So, but that's the thing is the norm changed, and then why did that change? So here's my view about the answer to your question is the big problem with these dating apps is that, man, everyone thinks the perfect partner is just around the corner. So yeah, I don't really feel like, look, I had this date with this guy set up for tomorrow at coffee or whatever, but there's this other guy who in the interim has asked me if I want to go water ski or whatever. And so in economics, we would call this the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost is the cost of what you're not doing your next best thing.
Yeah.
Opportunity costs have gone way up because
Mm.
people think, oh, there's this other option. So that's my view is people are just deluged with options. And what
Right.
that means is pretty easy. By the way, there's another problem, which is that this thing has a very toxic feedback loop because once people stop showing up like with high probability, let's say 50%, well, now people defend against that by double booking. They're like, okay, well, people are not going to show up. So I'm
I'm just
going
gonna
to,
double book.
I mean, and now you've got more people double booking, which makes it even less fun. So you've got this feedback loop. As people get less reliable, they make more dates, which makes them percentage-wise less reliable. So we're in a bad sort of what an economist would call a positive feedback loop or an equilibrium where, as long as there's temptations to not show up because there's a better guy or girl or whatever your preference is, you're less likely. You know what I mean?
Have you seen a lot of people just canceling, but not even like giving a person a heads up, just canceling and not showing up, like literally standing the person up? Is that like a problem?
Yeah, so getting stood up. My sense is that that's less common, but it definitely happens. I mean, I don't have access to the data sets from these apps, but like, I mean, my experience was definitely, I mean, people just don't show up, they block you, and you never, they go live
They
their
block
lives. So,
you.
you know what I mean? It's like they just float off. I have people who are looking for partners right now, and man, the number one complaint, of course, is, the no, there's not the perfect person for me. But the number two complaint is ghosting. They just disappear, you know.
Do you think there's such a thing as, I guess it depends on who you ask, but there are people that may not be ready for a relationship, but they think that they are, and they're heavily pushing towards it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I so I do think that's the case, and I think that a lot of data bears that out. So if you look at the number of people who are looking and are single, those numbers are drifting upwards, and I think it's an interesting question. So another stat that caught my attention was the fraction of people who are in, high school who haven't dated,
Hmm.
or the fraction of people who are going without sex until much later in life. It's
Yeah.
like people are developing a little later, and that intersects, I think, with this question of whether or not they're ready to be in a relationship, which goes back to your earlier point. I definitely think that there's a whole bunch of people who make these appointments, and they, at the moment when it's a distant, they expect to do it. And then when the moment comes, they get emotional, right? They get anxious. This happens all the time, right? So my partner and I were just down, and we took a scuba diving lesson, and you get these people who are gung ho to try it, and then they actually put the tanks on and they get into the water, and they're a little scared about it.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is that I think, one, later developing in terms of our social skills, and two, the fact that a lot of these, because some of these, experiences are going to be potentially, develop, you bring some anxiety. The
Yeah.
time comes, you're like, maybe I'll just watch Netflix.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Now, what you mentioned about being sexually active is a thing that I've noticed a lot with um I'm 30, right? But I guess people between like 18 and 30 or 18 and 28, let's say, um not really being in a relationship as much as I used to see, and then seeing actually I'm going to speak for men, right?
Yeah.
Young men not being as sexually active, and then also not just being sexually active because maybe they can't or because they're not really good at picking somebody up, but more so not even having the desire to,
Yeah.
and then that translates also to reproduction. Do you think that those like big changes could be attributed to maybe what happened during 2020 and like all the craze behind that, or you think this has been developing for far longer?
Yeah. So my read of that is it's been developing a little longer. So my sense is that, and here I'm drawing heavily on the work that John Haidt has done. So he's been looking at these sorts of questions, and he traces this back to around 2014. And so he sort of identifies the rise of social media. That was when social media really started getting going.
Yeah.
And his view is that a lot of what's going on with people who were growing up during that time and are growing up now has to do with what's going on with them, how they're spending their time, mostly on their phones and on the big platforms. And his claim, which I get, is that, those platforms are brutal in many ways. So one
Yeah.
is that you're constantly bombarded with seeing people who just seem to be, beautiful and smart and perfect and living their best lives. And man, again, I'm an evolutionary guy. So like our ancestors, pretty much everyone around you looked kind of like you did. They basically, if you were eating a pig, they were eating a pig, right? But now we get exposed towards infinite amount of people who seem to be having just the best lives. That's gotta be soul crushing, especially if maybe you're not living your best life. So that's one thing. Another
Yeah.
thing, of course, is it precludes, interpersonal interaction. Like you're on the phone, you're not in person. And then, of course, as you say, COVID made that worse. And then the final piece about this all is that I don't know to what extent this is important, but like it's scary out there. Like I think you specifically mentioned men. I mean, the number of ways in which a misunderstanding can lead to extremely unpleasant consequences on the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to be really careful these days. So, you put all those things together, not a lot of practice with interpersonal interaction, all of the anxiety from seeing everyone live their perfect lives, plus the fear of what might happen if there's an unpleasant interaction. I mean, I'm glad I'm past all that stuff. You know what I mean? I'm
Yeah, 100%, man. It's almost a shame, and also another thing I want to throw in there, pornography might be another thing that people just might be able, it might just be enough for them to watch a little bit of porn and, move on with their day and not really desire somebody else or a partner.
Totally. And that plugs into this. I think one underestimated concept is, like I mentioned earlier, opportunity costs. So,
Yeah,
the opportunity costs are different now because, people can throw on their VR sets or they can flip on the internet and have an experience, which is not quite the same, but it's not that far anymore. And,
yeah, no,
as soon as we have these, lifelike robots, I mean, there's going to be whole swaths of the population that we never see again because they're like, well, the physical stuff feels the same, and then the robot has an AI that knows exactly what I want to hear.
that's
Why would I leave
wild.
the house? You know what I mean?
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And it's not like, oh my God, it's 20 or 10 years away. No.
Yeah.
I've seen some wild stuff on the internet. And the way the AI is developing, it's just crazy to see. I almost like, you study this, and you've seen how, humans have evolved over, I guess tens of thousands of years, let's say, but the way that human beings the way you're going to be able to see the change in human beings, for example, from the year 2014, like you briefly mentioned, to maybe, let's say, 2035, 2040, it's going to be wild. Just in the way that people act, the way that people talk to each other. Because you see it now, like if you go to a dinner and everybody's on their phone. Like, it's so bad. We can't even put it down. Like, to hang out with the
Exactly.
people we wanted to hang out with. We just all want to hang out and be on the phone. That's wild. It's great. And
Totally.
I'm including myself in here because I tend to do it sometimes.
Sure. None of us are immune. So the other thing I do, which you sort of alluded to, so I write a Substack called Living Fossils, and one of the other authors on there is a guy named Josh, who's a clinician, and so he's got a front row seat to what's going on as normal everyday people struggle with new technologies and how that can lead to psychopathology and feelings of anxiety and depression, alienation. And when I think of, again, I think here we are, we're barely down from the trees. Like it's been 20 minutes since we were down from the trees, and you're faced with just like the sum total of the world's information at your fingertips and like the coolest video. Like I watch dog reunion videos. I mean, I will just take a few minutes out of my day and just scroll through the dog seeing, his person after a year. I'm like, I want to see that. That's
Yeah,
incredibly
yeah,
moving.
yeah.
But like we're defenseless because we have these brains that evolved in a world where people were basically camping. And now you've got all these tools around us. I mean, in some ways it's a miracle that we've lasted this long without even further degeneration. We're
Yeah.
just kind of dumb primates with really fancy tools, but our brains are slower than the technological change, and that is, again, is
Getting
something.
slower and getting slower.
Oh yeah. And it's scary. And again, like, again, from a clinical perspective, you can see this. And again, this is John Haidt, like we're not equipped to deal with this. And so it leads us to pathologies. And, I really like the idea of maybe trying to limit the amount of time that kids especially are spending on their phones.
Yeah.
Get them outside, get them interacting with people. Look, I'm not a parent, so I'm not in a good position to judge. But that seems to me like maybe not a bad way to go.
Yeah, but you could still guide the parents like down a specific road if you have experience and you're noticing people's behavior. You don't necessarily have to be a parent to be a positive influence on parents and the way they bring up their kids because you totally see it. I see it all the time, and it's really a shame, especially when I go out to retail, when you interact with young individuals that they don't look at you in the eye.
Mm.
And then imagine how an interaction would be in person after, like, let's say, for example, they meet on Bondzy, right? They communicate really well on Bondzy because they're used to talking to a screen. But when they get there in person, they are anxious, sweating, sweaty palms. Maybe their appetite goes away. All of a sudden, awkwardness takes over. Like, you know, it almost makes you wish that people had a little bit more confidence, not confidence to, to go out there and run amok and do crazy stuff, but confidence to just feel good in your own skin, whatever you look like or whatever you like.
Yeah, totally. And I think, in some ways, you mentioned porn. Like, I think there's also social relationship porn. Like, one of the things about having access to all the media we have is that, how many times a day do we see two characters interacting where they're both super clever and very charismatic? And my guess is it becomes a little bit difficult as a person not to at least some extent compare yourself, right? So, like, I'm watching this TV series right now with Vince Vaughn, and the character is drawn in this extremely charismatic way, and you sort of feel like, I wish I were that witty. He's a pretty clever guy,
Yeah.
and so, porn, you're like, is my partner the same as this? No, they don't. And then in the
Not
kind of
realistic.
so exactly. So you develop these unrealistic models, and that it's not surprising that people wouldn't be confident after that, right? Because it seems
Yeah.
like your whole world is filled with the most suave, debonair, well-dressed people. You're like, what do I do? Oh,
Yeah. It's so funny, like when you see like a specific lifestyle or a way, like a way of life on social media, but then you put the phone down and then you walk outside and it's like regular life. Like it's just
yeah.
like this illusion that everybody's like keeping up on social media, but then as soon as everybody puts the phone down, we're all just regular people for the most part. We all get along, you know? So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see what, social media could be a positive thing and also be a negative thing. Now, I wanted to talk to you, like, you mentioned artificial intelligence. You're pretty up to date on all this type of stuff. Um, have you envisioned a route for Bonzi where potentially people eventually could immerse themselves into a virtual reality where they could get to know each other a little bit better right before their dates? Maybe you've seen these models where of virtual reality where people put on a headset and maybe they're in a virtual bar or they're here, they're there. Do you think that maybe would also raise the probabilities of people not canceling each other or double bookings or stuff like that?
So yeah. So I think that you're really onto something, which is this, that another issue with all of these platforms is that, again, people can misrepresent themselves. They can post pictures from 10 years ago, they can make
Mm,
claims about who they are. And I think to the extent that I think people are much less likely to do that when they're face to face. And that plugs into another point about the cost of losing face-to-face interactions. People are just nastier when they're online, when they're at a distance, when they're on Twitter or X or what have you.
yeah.
So I totally agree. You know what I mean? Like the closer we can come to having a face-to-face interaction, people, as you say, people are just gentler and nicer,
Yeah.
when they're in person. And I do think that was a big issue with the lockdowns. So I will say for Bonzi right now, I see it as something that you attach to a dating platform rather than a dating platform itself. One of the
Yeah.
things about the entrepreneurial piece is that, find your niche. And
Yeah.
and my sense is that there's starting to be a little bit more fluorescence in the dating platform. It's not just Bumble and Tinder and Hinge or whatever. There's starting to be more sophisticated kind of ways for people to meet each other. But having said that, yeah, I feel like the richer the interaction, whether it's in VR or what have you, the better. I will say, one of the things that has amused me is that, now AIs are like taking over people's communication on these apps, right? So, the AIs um, wind up writing the messages because they know what's going to wind up being effective and continuing the conversation. So, like, who
Crazy.
knows what? Yeah, it is crazy. Who knows what direction that's going to go?
Let's talk about the local aspect, right? Like I mentioned, I'm not into the platform, so I'm not really
Yeah,
sure how some of them are marketing themselves. But when you talk to me about Bonzi and when you talk to me about human interaction and evolutionary psychology, I almost maybe envision part of the lifestyle of the app where we could understand the online component and understand the importance of it because you can't be everywhere at once, and maybe you wouldn't have ran into that person unless you spoke there. But um maybe a way where the brand is locally doing a lot of events, right, and
yeah.
giving people the opportunity to meet each other in person and then make it different and take them off the screen. Are you working towards that? Is that something that's on your radar?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. So one of the things that I've thought a lot about, and this goes back to my experience with the nonprofit. So one of the issues that, and I should also say my sister is in the entertainment space. So she's the general manager of a big entertainment organization here in town. One of the things that we've talked about in terms of a use case is, it doesn't have to be, it could be any appointment. So imagine a fundraiser. So, I've been part of a lot of planning for fundraising, and then people say they're going to come and they're going to do whatever, but they don't come. But now imagine you have a Bondzy. So the way that the app works right now is, it's possible for you to make a Bondzy for yourself so that if you don't show up, you sacrifice it. But the way we have it as well, you can do what we call reward Bondzys, where if you, Alex, are at this time or at this place at this time, so let's say at our event, you push the button and then you get whatever's in the little payload there. So in other words, I'm giving you like a tiny little incentive to go there. Now, what this means is that for something like a fundraiser, I as an organization can take my list of 100 people, say, look, if you come to the fundraiser, you're going to get this, whatever it is. And it could even, it could be anything. That's the right now the payload is just a link. So it could be a
Yeah.
link to a cash prize, or it could be a link to, a certificate that says I attended the event. It could be anything.
Yeah.
So, what I like about it is exactly what you're saying, is that from an organizational perspective, if you're trying to coordinate people being at the same place at the same time, the
Yeah.
app can do that because it can say, okay, here's a Bondzy, be here at this time, and give you an incentive to be there. That's sort of one of the use cases that we're very excited about.
Beautiful. Now, I have a question for you about development. What
Yeah.
challenges have you faced in transitioning from academic research to app development, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah. Well, the main thing, is that there's so many pieces to it, right? So you have to have a bunch of different skills. Now, as an academic, by the way, you don't realize how narrow your skill set is as an academic until you leave academia. And then you realize, oh, wow, I'm super good at, designing a research study and then writing it up and then nothing else. And so as as I'm sure as an entrepreneur, you have to have all these other skills. But I'll tell you what the most important thing for me is that as an academic, I was almost always sort of on my own. There's no support even at a place like Penn, you're pretty much on your own. I needed to learn about how to ask for help. And so thankfully I had a kind of a background in coding. When I was a grad student, I wrote my own experiments in Visual Basic, which dates me, but that's what I used. So there were a bunch of coding tasks which I was good at, but then there's a bunch of stuff that was new that I wasn't. And so I had, I had to call on some close friends, and I said, hey, can you help me with this? And then also I have a friend who's a wonderful woman, and she's just great at marketing. And I was like, can you help me with the marketing? Because I don't know anything about that stuff. So for me, like as an academic, you often don't, it's not really great. You can ask other people for stuff, but they typically, well, academics are a mean, selfish lot, to be perfectly candid. So
Mm.
they don't have the time to help you. But yeah, for me, it was that. I'll tell you the other thing, to go back to AI. I honestly believe if it hadn't been the fact that AI was rising as I was doing this, my whole experience would have been very different. Because a lot of times AI or ChatGPT or whoever it is like that, that cousin who just seems to know everything, or your uncle or whatever. And so that was hugely valuable for me. And I think part of it is, so those are the biggest chunks of it, was
Yeah.
being able to say, look, I don't know what I'm doing here. I need your help. And, sometimes that meant paying someone. Often that just meant having dinner with someone. I mean, the most important moment in Bondzy was when I had dinner with a guy named Ben, who I didn't know that well. He's in a startup. And I told him, man, I was kind of struggling. And he's like, are you contemplating like a product that will be embarrassing to ship? And I'm like, no. He's like, okay, that's your first mistake. If you're not embarrassed at the first product that you ship, you waited too long to get it to production. And I swear to God,
Done is better than perfect. Yeah.
so it was like this moment where I felt like a ton of bricks had been, and it was just because of that conversation. It was such a feeling. Oh, it doesn't have to be perfect. It can get great, but it doesn't have to at first. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that was the biggest thing for me, was the difference between being on my own, figuring everything out, reading the literature, writing the paper, as opposed to, hey, Alex, there's a thing that I don't know. There's a skill I need help. And that was a huge hurdle for me.
Absolutely. Makes total sense. So, how did you balance the academic work with your entrepreneurial pursuits, or how do you currently balance it?
So yeah, the literature in psychology says that people get worse when they task switch a lot, but I was so heavily influenced. Again, I was a total nerd. I say was, but come on. And so one of the things that struck me, Isaac Asimov, when I was a kid, I wrote him a letter and I got a postcard back from him, which I still have. It's actually hanging over there. He was like a hero to me. And one of the things Asimov said is in one of his interviews, he says, I don't get writer's block because if I'm struggling with some storyline or something, I just move on to something else and then it flows.
Mm.
So for me, having a bunch of different things has actually been helpful because when I got stuck on Bondzy, I was like, okay, I'll do some writing for the Substack. And then when I was stuck on the Substack, I was like, oh, I'm gonna write this grant for the organization. So for me, my particular personality is one in which, yeah, I can work steadily for a few hours, but once I hit that point where I've really hit diminishing returns, I've got something else that's productive, but different enough that it feels like, okay, I've got a fresh mind coming at it.
Yep.
That's the best thing about, I think, having a bunch of kind of interests is that once you sort of saturate in one area, you'll be like, okay, now I'm gonna do this other thing.
Good jump. Yeah, yeah. I could agree with that because I'm in a lot of stuff and sometimes it's just I'm burnt out in one area and then I jump to something else and right away I'm up and alive and I'm like getting all these ideas for this other thing. I'm like, maybe I need to give this a break and come back to it. So everybody's different though, right? Everybody has their process.
Exactly. I think that's one of the big pieces is that I don't want to try to say everyone should do this because that's something I discovered about myself is that when I switched, I'm kind of like what you just said. I think the big one is the ideas. Is like I just don't have any creativity, and then I come back to something, and then I've got a million of them. Like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, I was like in a rut. Again, I do think there's tons of individual differences on this. Some people are not like that, but I find I get recharged as I move to a new thing.
Good. Now, looking back at your academic career, what do you think is the most misunderstood concept of evolutionary psychology?
So one of the issues that we faced in our discipline is that when people hear things like evolution or biology, what they think we're saying is that traits are fixed, that they're genetically determined, that they're innate or whatever this very kind of like deterministic view. But that's not usually what we're saying. Like the thing about biology is that organisms develop in concert with the environment. So the environmental world that they live in matters a great deal. So the biggest problem we had was that people were taking us to say things about like that we're destined to do X, Y, or Z, when in fact humans are very flexible. So that was one big thing. I'll tell you the other big thing though was that, man, well, a lot of people have this weird intuition that facts have like a moral weight. So, I'm thinking about a lot of people who studied evolutionary psychology at the beginning, they were focused on the question of mate preferences because that was a very natural thing, right? Like, wow,
Hmm.
if you're studying evolution, you should look at preferences for who, mating and so on, just like the rest of the both the animal and the plant kingdom. And so, one of the findings was, well, men typically seek more variety and women seek investment or whatever. And
Yeah.
then, and then people hear that like, oh, so you're saying that men should just like be completely jerks. I'm like, no, I'm not telling men how to behave at all. I'm just saying,
It is what
here's
it
a,
is.
yeah, here's a pattern of data. And so that was a big thing is because you could get like halfway. I mean, it's funny, I remember I'm a little older than you are. So I remember there's a famous, in my world, famous researcher, a guy named David Buss, who came to my undergraduate institution and he gave a talk to the audience. It was a psychology audience. And man, at the end of it, it was like, it wasn't quite like the modern moment where campuses are crazy, but there was a lot of anger.
Mm.
In particular, there's a faculty member's name was Sandy Bem, and she got up and she really laid into David in a way that, for me as a student, as an undergraduate, looking at these professors kind of yelling at each other. I was like, why are we getting so upset about this? I mean, so I think there's two parts of it. One is the sense of inevitability, like, oh, there's nothing we could change, which is a misunderstanding. And then the other one is this weird idea that when we say a fact, we're condoning it or that it has some moral weight. I struggled my whole career with those two misconceptions and misunderstandings. And honestly, I don't think much is changed. I don't like to be pessimistic, and some things have gotten a little better, but like science is a very strange world. It's not what I thought it was. It wasn't like, I always thought that science was going to be like the Vulcan Science Academy. Again, nerd, Star Trek, where, people sit around and say, well, I see the evidence is strongly in favor of the view. And then someone else, yes, but it's not like that at all. It's, I want to save my little pet theory and I'm going to attack you
Right.
for your theory. And
Yeah.
we're going to fight over who gets the
Cherry
extra.
pig data and all that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 It's not great. Don't get me wrong. It's a better way than any other we have to figure out what's true,
Yeah.
but it's not great the way it works. You know what I mean?
Robert, talk to me about what stage Bondzy's is at now. Like, where is it?
So you can find it in both in Google Play and you can find it in iOS in Apple's App Store.
Mhm.
I'm currently right now getting user feedback. So we had a really good event the other day. It was like a treasure hunt, a scavenger hunt, whatever you want to say, where I paired up with someone here and people had to go to a particular place, a particular time, and then they got the clue to the next one. And that was a really nice field test for Bondzy. That's where we are now, just trying to get some users to take a look at it, get some get some feedback about what features are cool, what would they like to see.
Of course.
And we'll go from there. It's we it hasn't been around that long, so I didn't finish that long ago. Basically, this year it finally got done.
It's a
And again,
baby.
it's
Yeah.
it's a little baby right now. I'm proud of it, but it's a little baby. As you're saying, I have other fish to fry, and
Yeah.
so it hasn't always been as fast as maybe I would have liked, and I don't always have the attention to it. But again, the satisfaction that you get from shipping something, it's pretty good. I mean, again, as an academic, we used to gather data sets and we wouldn't see anything come out of it for 5 years. Whereas in the development world, if you're quick, you can, 6 months, 9 months, get something done.
Yeah.
And that was great. I should say it wasn't my first app development. I worked on another project which never saw the light of day. I was working with a developer. We just couldn't get across the finish line. And I got to tell you, man, that really was a really strong lesson for me to be like, just at least get it done, because we got it 98% this other one. It was a
Yeah.
piece of optional software. There's just nothing like getting, I don't know, there's just kind of nothing like getting something out there which people might be able to use and with luck make some people's lives better. I mean, I know that's
Yeah.
cliche in the tech world, but if I'd been able to persuade people that I was going to show up, man, that definitely would have improved my life.
How do you want to be remembered?
You know, that is a great question. I, I am very proud of the scholarly work that I did. I wrote a couple books and I have some papers which are pretty well cited. But I gotta say, during this phase of my life, having the chance to work with an organization that is on the ground, helping people who don't have much, don't speak the language in many cases, don't have access to healthcare. I think that for me, I want to be remembered as someone who, made a contribution to science, and there's some ideas I think they're going to last. But then when had a chance to reinvent myself after leaving the academy, tried to give back a little bit because I think that would be a nice legacy to leave.
I agree. Where can we connect with you on socials, Robert?
I'm on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it, at R Kurzban. That's R and then my last name. And then I'm on Substack. It's called The Living Fossils. Just Google Living Fossils on Substack. That's where the new content pops out every Wednesday.
Beautiful. Robert, listen, I've had a great time chatting with you today. Really excited to see what you're doing with your app. I know it's a baby, but you have a lot of enthusiasm behind it and some great ideas, and I know it's going to do well. Hopefully, we can have you back on the pod someday. Until then, everybody, if you like what you heard today, if you want to learn more about Bondzy, if you want to even read some of the books that Robert has mentioned, everything is going to be linked on the show notes on the website and on whatever app you're listening on right now. So until next time, this is Alex Quin, Robert Kurzban. Hustle inspires hustle. See you on the next episode.